Pour notre dernier panel aujourd'hui, nous
For our last panel today, we have the Honourable Member David McGuinty, Chair of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, and Sean Jorgensen, Director of Operations, Secretariat of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security and Information.
McGuinty, you may now proceed with your opening remarks. You have up to 7 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and honourable members of the committee. Thank you for your invitation to appear this evening. C'est avec plaisir que je vous parle.
It is with great pleasure that I will talk about the work of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, also known as NSICOP.
Known as NSICOP. As this is my first time before your committee, I will provide a brief overview of the committee and proceed with outlining our 2020 annual report, as well as our 2019 review of foreign interference. I will also touch upon recommendations we made regarding ensuring the integrity of our elections. As you know, colleagues, NSICOP was established in 2017 and is composed of parliamentarians from both houses. Members all hold a top secret security clearance and are permanently bound to secrecy under the Security of Information Act. We cannot, under any circumstance, claim parliamentary privilege in a case of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. La responsabilité.
The main responsibility of our committee is to conduct studies in the national safety and information milieu and the organizations that form it. The reports of NSICOP are unanimous and nonpartisan. Our 2020 annual report was mainly focused on national security threats in terms of what has changed in recent years and what was the impact of the pandemic on these threats.
Security and intelligence organizations described 5 main threats to Canada's national security when the committee began its work in 2018. They were terrorism, espionage and foreign interference, cyber threats, organized crime, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I will focus on espionage and foreign interference and cyber threats as likely being of most interest to this committee, but encourage you to consult the full report. Espionage involves the theft of information, while foreign interference involves the use of clandestine means or threats to promote a certain objective. However, the perpetrators often pursue them in tandem. The committee conducted a review of foreign interference in Canada in 2019. It found that foreign interference posed a significant threat to the security of Canada, and that continues to be the case today. The pandemic has also created opportunities for foreign states to target Canada's health sector, most notably in the area of vaccine development. Turning to malicious cyber activities, there are a wide array of threats facing Canada. I note that the committee is currently conducting a review of the government's cyber defense. Russia and China remain the most significant, sophisticated, and state-sponsored threats, targeting government and non-government systems. State actors also conduct online disinformation campaigns in Canada and among our allies. Let me now turn to our review examining the threat of foreign interference in Canada and the government's response to that threat presented in 2019. The committee agreed to focus its efforts on traditional person-to-person foreign interference. Of particular interest, we highlighted China's Operation Fox Hunt. It involves clandestine and coercive repatriation activities targeting apparent economic fugitives and corrupt officials, including in Canada. Chinese security officials carry out the campaign in a number of ways, including police and prosecutors working with the RCMP to arrange to meet fugitives to purportedly gather evidence and discuss their cases. In response to fox hunt activities, Global Affairs Canada established an interdepartmental working group that met regularly to discuss the campaign. The RCMP imposed increasingly stringent criteria on PRC investigators, yet activities continued. Nous avons constaté que la
We noted that the government's response to the threat of foreign interference was considerable and sustained. It was done on a case-by-case basis, and our mobilization in terms of other levels of government and the Canadian public was limited. The committee recommended that the government establish a cross-government strategy to fight foreign interference and to strengthen the resilience of institutions and Canadians as described under Section 297. With respect to the risk of foreign interference in our democratic processes, allow me to mention the Jim Judd report, which was written in pursuant to public protocol with respect to major election events. States who try to interfere in Canada's election process use several methods, including trying to influence people running in ridings, or in terms of promoting a candidate or hampering another candidate. They can also take efforts to try to spread hate or accentuate partisan differences.
This happens to all parties across all orders of government. The committee supported recommendations to reestablish the public protocol well in advance of the next federal election and to extend its mandate to the pre-writ period. The committee also believed that the government should consider ensuring that the mandate of the protocol include all forms of foreign interference, consider including prominent Canadians as members of the panel, ensure that all parties understand the purpose of the protocol and the process for raising a potential issue, and consider how the panel would inform Canadians about an incident of foreign interference. Mr. Chair, to conclude, threats to the security of Canada are fluid. They change. These are all things which we parliamentarians from across the political spectrum should continue to pay attention to and to seek ways to address through our hearings, our work on legislation, and our engagement with Canadians. Finally, Mr. Chair, before going forward, hopefully for questions, I want to remind you and members these reports, both hard copies of which were sent to the members, are 230 pages in length. They comprise 456 paragraphs in one report, 125 paragraphs in another. And all of this work is predicated on 28,000 pages of documentation and dozens of witnesses and experts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGuinty. Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, nous commençons.
Thank you. Now we're going to start with our first round of questions with Mr. Paulus. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Hello, Mr. McGuinty, and thank you for being with us today. The report is rather clear, and also it's public and doesn't contain any critical information, so top secret clearance is not necessary, obviously. So to help you a bit to clarify things, I'd like to make a parallel with what's happened in Australia. First, Australia was a victim of cyber attacks. Political parties were attacked. And also, there's a paragraph in your report that mentions that there was a direct impact right in the midst of a pandemic in June of 2020 against schools, companies, hospitals even. So my question is, can we draw a parallel here in terms of what's happened in Australia? And well, could we experience the same type of attacks here? Thank you very much for your question. The simple answer is yes. Anything's possible in Canada. We cited in 2019 in our main recommendation to government the example of what Australia did to create a more centralized system, a more coordinated leadership system to deal with everything surrounding the issue of foreign interference. And we put forward that model for the government's consideration. I think Minister Blair circulated a document of 18 or 19 pages describing what the government has done since that report was released. But with what we've seen, anything is possible. Right now, what we're seeing in Canada well, if we look at what's happening in defense and what's happening in different departments, we think that it's urgent to pool our efforts because there's a lot of silos happening, something that happened 2-3 years ago. But perhaps there's another way we can do things in Canada that could create issues, because we always think we're no one's enemy. But what we've seen in the report, it's clear we're also a victim of attacks. And it's not just from China, but yes, there is China, and we're talking about that today. But in the report, they also mention the possibility of an attack that could happen when there's a conflict, when there's an armed conflict, for example, between states. And we've seen in the United States, they were directly attacked on their pipeline, and there's no open conflict. And Canada, should the hydroelectric or oil system could they experience such an attack even though there's no armed conflict involved?
The report sets out the risks inherent to Canada's critical infrastructure. It highlights what has taken place in other jurisdictions. It even highlights the fact that our communications security establishment played a critical role in finding and detecting threats to American critical infrastructure and shared it with the United States. So in the report, yes, we lay out very clearly some of these, the magnitude of some of these threats. And we also, of course, have a number of prescriptions in our 2019 report on how to deal with these. And chief amongst these, to go back to what I said earlier, sir, is we need a central, coordinated, pan-Canadian approach to dealing with the question of foreign interference. Okay. And we need to get it now.
Okay. Parlons d'interférence, justement, l'interférence.
In terms of interference, particularly election interference, right now we're talking about influence on several levels of government, not just federally, but also provincially. The provinces are rather independent in the way they're managed. And I think there have been discussions with certain individuals that have serious concerns in provincial governments because they're also victims of cyber attacks and influence on their territories. In your recommendations, you've also pointed to something that we could do to help our provinces. Yes, in 2019, we clearly described the challenges. There's the federal government and risk communication with other levels of government in Canada and the public in Canada. And what we did in response to the Judd report, we also made recommendations to improve the composition and the mandate of the panel that was created to receive complaints and information if there's a cyber issue or other types of issues during a federal election. We still have much progress to make because we noted in the report that foreign interference in our political system and in our elections does happen with all political parties at the House of Commons, and it happens at all levels of government. Last question quickly. Do you think that the Chinese Liberation Army is an important actor behind all of this? If I may, Chair, I'd like to ask Mr. Jorgensen to answer that question. I think he has more to say about that.
Actually, I'm sorry, we're at the end of Mr. Paulus's time, but perhaps we have another opportunity for that. I regret it. We're over the 6-minute point, just over. So now I have to go on, I'm afraid, to Mr. I'm happy to do so, of course, but I regret leaving Mr. Paulus. We'll go on to Mr. Fagiskatos for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I didn't hear any regret in your voice, so we're all good there. Mr. McGuinty, thank you very much for being here tonight, and to Mr. Jorgensen as well. I really appreciate your time. Mr. McGuinty, what can you share with the committee about Canada's election integrity? You mentioned that at the outset of your remarks, but we'd like to hear more on that, if possible.
If we turn to the report on page or paragraph starting paragraph 12 in the 2020 annual report, Canadians, members can see a description of the critical election incident public protocol that was put into place, a big name, basically creating a panel of 5 persons chaired by the clerk of the Privy Council to be on guard for Canadians during the federal election process. When it was originally constituted, it was all about receiving information about cyber interference activities during a federal election. A report was then prepared by Jim Judd, the former head of CSIS, and that report, under the cabinet decree, was sent to NSICOP for review. And as a result of deliberations, the committee made a number of recommendations to the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada to improve that panel. And we illustrated as well, of course, as Monsieur Paulu just referred to. If you look at paragraph 70 of our report, we reference the fact that China likely launched cyber attacks on the Australian Parliament and 3 largest political parties before its last general election. And we cite, of course, Russian activities in the U.S. 2016 presidential election.
Thank you very much for that. I do want to ask you a general question about 3 specific things on espionage, on foreign interference, and on cyber attacks. To what extent is Canada active, working in concert with other countries, middle powers in particular, to counter any impact of those on our democracy? What can you share with us on that?
Look, I think it's fair to say in our 2019 foreign interference review, we indicated that we have a lot of work to do in improving cooperation between the federal, provincial, and municipal orders of government on this front. We also have a lot of work to do to enhance, as one of your speakers said earlier on your other panel, to enhance Canadians' understanding of the threats. But one of the things that we did do is we joined up with the G7, forgive me, to create a rapid response mechanism in 2018 in the summit in June 2018. We're now cooperating amongst the G8 to have a rapid response mechanism to follow and get informed about things that might be occurring in each of our respective jurisdictions. So there's a significant amount of cooperation going on, but we believe there's much more progress to make from a whole of government perspective in the Canadian context.
Thank you very much. And with the final question here, you did mention that a focus of the committee has been terrorism. I wanted to ask you specifically on the rise of the incel subculture and any thoughts that you can share on that. I know that in the public reports that have been issued by the committee that has come up, and I think it speaks to the fact that the nature of national security is changing. The nature of terrorism, in fact, is changing. If you could elaborate on that and any overlap that exists between incel subculture and white supremacist movements, if there's a connection between those two. Some have made that observation in the past.
Time being of the essence, Mr. Chair, I would recommend that members take a look at paragraphs 31 forward in our 2020 annual report. We clearly lay out the rise of this IMVE, ideologically motivated violent extremism movement. It is spreading and is spreading quickly. Canada has a very large per capita participation, up to 6,600 identified right-wing extremist channels, pages, groups, and accounts. Many, many, many different actors. At least 100 white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups existed in Canada, but now we believe that's up to about 300. So the growth has been exponential. It's a serious risk to Canada's national security, and we've laid it out in very clear form with all of the information that we could provide Canadians.
It looks like I have around 45 seconds left. So when you say, Mr. McGuinty, that on a per capita basis, Canada, the numbers are very high, can you elaborate on that in comparison to other democracies? Are we singled out in that sense?
Well, what we talk about, what we point to in the report is that one prominent message board alone, for example, on which Canadians are more active, or much more active than American and British users. The point about this is that extremist dialogue is not necessarily criminal, but Canada is providing a large base from which to recruit or to become radicalized from within and from without the country. And that is one of the trends that's most worrisome. One of the biggest changes in our 2020 annual report compared to what we saw in 2018 in the same area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frederick. And maintenant, on continue avec Madame Normandin.
And now we're going on with Ms. Normandin for 10 minutes. Hello, Mr. McGuinty and Mr. Jorgensen. Unfortunately, I spent a short trip in your area and I didn't want to leave, but my next question is about someone who, Mr. Bergeron, who I'm replacing today. He's very interested in this and he has a question. Yes, the committee is nonpartisan and unanimous, but could we know more about Mr. Bergeron's file for becoming a candidate? Good evening, Ms. Normandin. Sorry for having lost you on the committee, but I'm also sorry because I can't provide you any information about the status of what's happening at the Prime Minister's office and at the Privy Council. We are missing a few committee members. We lost 2 members from the Liberal Party. A few changes were proposed with the Conservative Party. So I think all of this is being studied right now by the Prime Minister and his personnel. Thank you very much for the update. I'd also like to hear what you have to say. Well, you mentioned it in your preliminary remarks, what you have to say about the resilience of institutions and Canadians. One of the last committee hearings, Mr. Schnokilya came to testify, and he talked, amongst other things, about the role of CSIS that's trying to raise awareness with private companies. And the committee somewhat repressed this. They said that CSIS made an error, and he said that no, CSIS did the right thing in that situation. I'd like to hear what your comments would be about that. Is that something that will be changed going forward with respect to the committee's position on that? One of the challenges that we faced during our analysis in terms of foreign interference is the fact that in many sectors in Canada, people don't have the right to receive classified briefings because they don't have the secret or top secret clearance that is necessary to hear what's happening. And for example, we've seen this very same situation with our universities today. We saw measures were announced in Alberta recently, and many administrators and academics and presidents of universities are scratching their heads. They're wondering what's happening exactly. That was one of the challenges that our government has to address. It's part of what we identified in terms of our pan-governmental approach. I think now we have to open up a bit, and it's up to CSIS to define how we open up and to whom. But growingly, we've seen, even in terms of municipal police, they don't often understand what foreign interference means. So there's a lot of progress to be made in that area and to be communicated. Thank you very much. My next question is about the role of international allies. Ms. Brainy testified recently at the committee. We talked about the situation of Australia, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about the UK that has just did an integrated review of security, defense, development, and foreign policy report. We haven't seen this since the Cold War, and they seem to be very interested in the resilience of their infrastructure and their national structures in terms of the Five Eyes. Canada may seem a bit more laxist with respect to Huawei, and the UK seems to be perhaps a little bit more concerned with respect to the ownership of certain types of technology that is being used. Is that something that is worrisome or that the committee is looking at with respect to a study? The immediate question with respect to Huawei and the use of this technology is not one that was addressed by our committee. That's one thing. And secondly, what the UK has done and the study they did is something rather extraordinary and hasn't been done in Canada for decades. How all of this is linked and organized, or are we being effective? Is there real value for money, like we say? Well, there's much progress to be done. And that's a question that the committee did talk a bit about, but we haven't yet had the time to address it because right now we're really focused with other reviews in terms of cyber attacks and other departments and the RCMP. But that is an excellent suggestion to look at as some inspiration. Thank you. And quickly, speaking of technology, could they have a role to play with respect to those who are seeking to fight against the use of technology by China insidiously? Could that be another potential topic? Perhaps, but once again, it's not a topic that we discussed or that was presented to our committee. We're very disciplined in that respect. We really only look at what we really discussed in committee, but these are excellent suggestions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Normandin.
Mr. Harris for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. McGuinty, for coming to us tonight, and appreciate your work on the on NCCOP. And I'd like to talk a little bit about foreign influence in Canada with respect to criminal activity, particularly things like money laundering as it affects the activities in Canada of criminalized gangs, some of them with this foreign influence connections. And the estimates that you quote in your report indicate that there's an upper estimate of $100 billion of investment in Canada through money laundering. I would call it investment using the term loosely, most prominently in real estate and casinos. And these are the most publicly discussed domestic examples, but it's also been looked into by CSIS and the RCMP and referenced, of course, in your 2018 and 2019 reports of a project called Project Sidewinder, referenced in a paper that was produced by Anne-Marie Brady, who's appeared before us. And she relies on the 1997 draft report between CSIS and RCMP with the code name Project Sidewinder, which was aimed to gather and analyze intelligence efforts by the Chinese government, intelligence about efforts by the Chinese government and Asian criminal gangs to influence Canadian business and politics. Now, that's a very serious subject, of course, but this leaked report from 1997 draft was, in fact, discredited by CERC itself in 1999 and 2000, and said it didn't really meet the standards of professional and analytic rigor. But they also noted that they revised the report, and a finalized version was issued in January 1999. But for some reason, NCCOP in 2018 or 2019 don't refer to the finalized Sidewinder report. So my question is that a report available to the NCCOP for its review, and was it aware of it, and did it ask for it?
Mr. Chair, could I ask my Director of Operations and Research to take a stab at that question? I don't want to get this wrong. That's a very pointed question about a single document, if I could.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only thing I would say about that is we didn't ask for that specific report. So if we were to, I believe it would be available to us. There would be nothing preventing us from getting it, but we didn't ask for it. And with respect to Ms. Brady, I understand that she did reference it, but when we referenced Ms. Brady's reports, it was in a much broader context and on the basis of a much wider research and analytic review that she conducted.
So my concern, though, is that the idea of this money laundering and the criminal gang activity occurring in Canada with the extent that's been noted was identified as being related to foreign interference and the connection to foreign interference. And your report in 2020 doesn't even talk about it in terms of foreign interference. It talks about having some commercial influence and perhaps inflating housing prices and putting out of reach of large segments of the population. The only mention of potential trouble is a footnote to paragraph 90, citing an article, says how Chinese gangs are laundering drug money through Vancouver real estate, but no mention in your 2020 report at all talks about this having some Chinese government influence, which is the subject of the Sidewinder report in its revised form. And I'm just wondering why it is that this would be missed by NCCOP and in its reporting in 2020 when it made reference to it in 2018 and 2019.
That's an omission I cannot address for you, Mr. Harris. I can certainly get back to you and find out. I think the report, though, does talk about the resurgence of groups, how many of those are considered to be national security threats, to what extent some of these groups are transnational. We talk about the fact the RCMP is conducting a number of priority investigations related to transnational serious organized crime. We talk about the limitations at FinTrack and its ability to track international monies that are coming into Canada for laundering. So I think we've tried to capture as best we can, but on that particular point, unless Mr. Jorgensen's got more information, I'll definitely get back to you.
Yeah, that I only have a short time left, so perhaps I should ask a question. Would NCCOP be interested in knowing the extent of whether or not there is governmental influence, Chinese government influence in this, and whether this is actually being studied and had been studied for decades by the various security agencies? There seems to be a bit of a lack of thorough review of that. Would that be of interest to NCCOP in the future?
I think it would be. I'm not so certain it's a lack of thorough. We did tackle 29,000 pages of documents, so we did the best we could. But certainly, we'll come back to you, and I'll check with my team.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Harris. I will now go to the second round, which will have to be a little bit abbreviated as we finish at 9:30. We'll start with Ms. Stubbs for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Hi, Mr. McGuinty. Nice to see you again on this committee now. Certainly, as you've pointed out in your comments today and in the 2020 NCCOP report, which says, quote, the threat from espionage and foreign interference is significant and continues to grow, and that China and Russia remain the primary culprits. And these are the most significant long-term threats to Canada's sovereignty and prosperity. I guess I noted, though, that the 2018 NCCOP annual report also said, quote, China is known globally for its efforts to influence Chinese communities and the politics of other countries. The Chinese government has a number of official organizations that try to influence Chinese communities and politicians to adopt pro-China positions. It cites wealthy Chinese businessmen, Chinese students, mobilized diaspora populations, political donations, demonstrations, and influencing Chinese language media. And certainly Canadians are hearing more and more about the implicit and explicit and multi-layered threats to academia and the political sphere and research and technology and science and the scientific sectors. So I guess it's fair, I think, would you say, for us to draw a conclusion that it's evident that threats to Canadians from China's communist regime has continued to grow and to evolve. And so I wonder if, for all of us, you could just highlight, the highest priority measures that the government should implement to combat foreign interference from China and protect the safety and security of Canadians. Because even on an example like Operation Fox Hunt, you probably know I've asked multiple questions about this issue. The United States has made several arrests, yet still in Canada, neither officials nor Canadian elected representatives can say that any of that is happening. Just what are the highest priority things that the government should implement right now to protect Canadians?
It's an excellent question, Ms. Stubbs. Thank you for that. And in the report in 2019, we do lay out each of those really core areas: media influence, academic circles influence, political campaigns and politics influence. So we've tried to break it down by sector almost, as you've enumerated. But We've also kept the number of recommendations in our 2019 report review on foreign interference to a very small number. In fact, really 2. And the recommendation is about this comprehensive strategy to counter foreign interference and build institutional and public resiliency. And on page 109, or paragraph 297 of this 2019 report, we break it down. We talk about what's got to be dealt with sector by sector by sector, how it might be dealt with, including what are the short and long-term risks to Canadian institutions and the rights and freedoms posed by foreign interference. What are the range of institutional vulnerabilities targeted by hostile foreign states? And on it goes to give a bit of a work plan for that pan-Canadian approach that would be core to upping our game in this area. And the second major recommendation I want to come to with your forbearance, if with your patience, is a recommendation we've made now twice in a row to the government and to the Prime Minister. And that is that members of Parliament and senators should be briefed in detail on foreign interference activities that they may be subject to immediately upon swearing in and regularly thereafter. Because as one of your witnesses said in an earlier panel, many of us in the political elected public service life don't always understand what might be happening around us. So we've kept the recommendations down to 2, and the recommendation number 5, as it's called, is really a key breakdown sector by sector.
Thank you. And given that Australia has passed a pretty multi-pronged concrete policy approach to this issue, I'm wondering, I don't know if you can comment, but do you have any insight as to like what is the holdup for Canada? Why is this taking seems like an extraordinarily long time, given that this has been going on since the 90s? And also in your work, for the people who say, as we've heard and you've said, that they feel like they have no place to go, like they go to the police for the CSIS, they go back and forth. Do you have any insight into what exactly the barriers are and what are the specific solutions?
On the first question of speaking for the government, I'm really not in a position to do that except to reference Minister Blair's 18-page document sent out to all MPs.
Mr. McGuinty, I'm
in
sorry,
December.
but Ms.
Thank you,
Stubbs'
Mr.
time
Chair.
is up. I regret that.
Sorry.
I'm sorry about that. But now I have to go on to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes, please.
Nice to see you here, Mr. McGuinty. This is your 3rd annual report, and this year's version isn't the first to highlight threats posed by foreign interference. Over the past year, Canadians have been seeing and hearing more from CSIS about this issue more than ever before. We've heard recently that while a former CSIS director in 2010 had sounded the alarm on foreign interference from the government of China, the public safety minister called the decision regrettable, and the PMO admonished the CSIS director for doing his job. Last year, CSIS contacted more than 225 entities across Canada and briefed at least 2,000 Canadian stakeholders. In your opinion, what do recent efforts by CSIS to raise awareness say about the level of seriousness granted to this issue?
I think the committee would say that it's encouraging that CSIS and its director is reaching out to engage more openly, giving keynote speeches, explaining the landscape, explaining the risks, the threats, the magnitude of some of these threats, and the magnitude of the opportunity in getting it better for Canadians, protecting their rights, for example. But in our 2019 report, we also are very open and we're very, very transparent and objective. The committee insisted in putting in where we're falling short in engaging with Canadians, where we're falling short in engaging with provinces, universities, institutions, to give them more information about what is happening. So that is rife at the back end of our foreign interference review chapter in the 2019 report, copy of which I hope you have. And I think we've been very transparent and objective in pointing that out.
Where have we been given more information for the universities?
My understanding, as we've documented in the report, is that CSIS regularly meets with university administrators to walk them through some of the risks. I would say that I think there's work to be done in this area. I think that, as I said earlier, with the decision by the province of Alberta to cease all scientific research relationship with China, if I understand the announcement, I think the administrators, the academics there are trying to figure out what is the best way forward to deal with this. And they certainly are going to need some assistance and help as they wrestle this to the ground.
So in your report, you also noted that there's many threats to our national security and that the landscape is changing, and you devote significant attention to right-wing extremism. You note that actors are active online with 6,600 channels, pages, groups, and accounts, and Canadians are sometimes more active than their US or UK counterparts. How serious is this threat, and what can better be done to address it?
I would say, Ms. Yip, that the committee concluded that between 2018 and 2020, this was the single greatest difference in the survey, the compendium of threats that we produce for Canadians. This is the only publicly produced, publicly available overview of the main national security threats produced by the Government of Canada, this new process we started. But the biggest change we've seen from 2018 to 20 is this growth in IMVEs and in this incel, this involuntary celibate movement. It is very worrisome. We've seen, for example, serious increases in neo-Nazi groups. They are active, they are growing. Of course, a number of them have been since listed by the Government of Canada as terrorist entities. In fact, 4 IMVE groups have been included by the government, which is a good start. But we've tried to lay this out so people understand. And of course, we've also, Mr. Chair, through you, we've also indicated to Canadians that the pandemic has had a profound influence on driving more of this activity underground. It's led to an uptake in this activity, probably because so many of us are home-based, or our ability to move about and take on more active lives has been constrained.
The listing of those organizations, is that part of the terror code listings process? Could you just talk a bit about that?
It is, and the government on February 3rd, I think it was, February 2021, listed 13 new groups as terrorist entities and reviewed 7 others. So I know that through that process, 4 groups, Atomwaffen Division, the Base, the Proud Boys, and the Russian Imperial Movement have been now classified as terrorist entities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yip. Et maintenant, Madame Normandin, pendant...
And now, Ms. Normandin, you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you very much. People sometimes joke about things in the opposition parties, saying that the government is better at creating tables to support reports rather than really implementing the recommendations. But in 2019, there was a report that said that, well, there was recommendations about foreign interference. And can you tell us what efforts the government made to implement these various recommendations? Thank you very much, Ms. Normandin. To begin, I think that Minister Blair partially responded to our report. Also, he responded to the opposition motion in the House of Commons to produce a 18 or 20-something page document that was circulated to all members of the House, showing what the government is doing or has done or will do. But it raises a real question about how the government responds to our recommendations. And the committee thinks there is much work to be done and much progress that is possible in this area. We've already completed 6 reviews and other annual reports. We produced 22 recommendations, etc. We spend a lot of time on these reports and recommendations. So we think that since they're unanimous, nonpartisan, and all parties participate in them, we think that the recommendations are more amenable to being implemented. So we're waiting for more efforts from the government to respond to what we're recommending. In that context, would it not be relevant to have a new way of proceeding when you start a study on a topic? Could you not also review the recommendations and how they were responded to? You actually read into the committee's approach. We discussed that in great detail, and we think we have to carry forward the recommendations that were done from one report to another. There should be a mandatory briefing for members and senators. Thank you very much, Ms. Normandin.
Mr. Harris, for the last 2.5 minutes. Mr. Harris, please.
Thank you very much. If I may follow up on what Ms. Normandy was speaking about just now, you just outlined that you've made 22 recommendations that were fully unanimous, fully nonpartisan to the government. Do you have any plans to review those recommendations and do a report on to what extent you see the government has followed them? Because if they're that that unanimous and that clear, then they deserve respect. I think you're being very diplomatic, shall we say, when you say that there's more work to be done to fulfill the recommendations. That's a nice way of saying that they haven't been followed. So I wonder, can you tell us that your committee is likely to do a special report, perhaps, on saying where are we with the 3 sets of recommendations that we've made? Here's what we see happening, and here's what we see missing as a priority for government.
Mr. Harris, that's an excellent question, and it's something the committee is really seized with. I don't want to be diplomatic. I want to be forthright. It's a huge amount of work to come to ground in a nonpartisan way with these recommendations. We really deliberate long and hard. We're looking for recommendations that will improve the situation in the security and intelligence field and when it comes to protecting our rights and freedoms. So we believe, and I have spoken to the Prime Minister about this. I've spoken to his National Security and Intelligence Advisor about this. And we believe that regular and substantive responses to our recommendations would really strengthen accountability and increase transparency in the security and intelligence community. So in the UK, our equivalent organization, the ISC, receives regular government responses because they have an MOU with the government. That's something that might be considered here in Canada, but we are certainly now raising with the Prime Minister and the government how to better get feedback and information about those recommendations and what's happening with them, even though 1 or 2 of them have found their way directly into mandate letters for cabinet ministers.
Just have a brief moment, I see from the chair, but I do want to second your suggestion that a lot of work is done by your committee. I know from representatives from our party that's been part of that committee, there's a tremendous amount of work that takes place, and I want to commend you for it and thank you and all of your committee for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. That's a good way to conclude, I think. Thank you very much, Mr. McGuinty. Thank you, colleagues. Meeting adjourned.